Okay, so we're back with Ian Perry for some more cricket history. Ian, how are you?
Hi there. I'm very well, thanks. I'm looking forward to my second game of the season tomorrow. We're playing against the Wine Trade Cricket Club, so
That will be
cheerio,
good.
chin chin. Yeah,
A
yes.
good one, and no doubt you can stock up.
Well, they do have a habit of bringing samples to the game, so whether I actually remember it after that is a different matter entirely.
If there was ever an incentive to play, I think for me that'd be a good one.
They're really lovely hosts. Yeah. Anyway,
so
we
Ian,
didn't really come here to talk about getting drunk at cricket.
no, well, so I'm sure we could do an episode on getting drunk at cricket and the beers involved. So Ian, obviously we normally have a history topic and then a moment in time or a family tale, but you being you and the special man you are, we've decided to combine the two today. So
That's true.
Obviously a very well-known phrase to describe a passage of cricket. And Ian, really, I guess the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to basically take us back to 1932-33, the Ashes tour in Australia, and what, of course, became known to the world as Bodyline. Now, fast, short pitch bowling has always been part of the game, and hopefully it always will be, because it's a legitimate part of the fast bowler's attack, and it tests the batsman's resolve, their courage, as well as their technique and their reactions. But of course, when it's used to excess, then it becomes intimidation, it becomes unsportsmanlike, and as we'll see in a second, it can even actually impact on international relations. Now, by the middle of 1932, Don Bradman had already established a pretty impressive reputation. Although he had an inauspicious start, back in 1928, he made 18 and 0 in his first test, which was against England at Birmingham. After that, he very quickly got into his stride. By the middle of 1932, he'd already scored 2,600 runs and he was averaging 112. So, yeah,
Retire
6 centuries.
Just retire there. Just hang your boots up. You're done. You don't need to do anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you'd think, wouldn't you? I mean, he'd already scored 6 single centuries, 5 doubles, one of which was 299 not out, and then that triple against England at Headingley. So, he was already absolutely motoring.
Most players worry about converting 50s into hundreds. His biggest worry was converting hundreds into doubles. It's a nice problem to have.
And doubles into triples. Yeah. I mean, first world problems as they stand. And of course, he wasn't the only batsman in the side. You've got Stan McCabe, you've got Bill Ponsford, you've got Woodfull, all of them in their prime, and Fingleton was just at the start of his career as well. So this was a really, really strong batting lineup. Over the summer, Douglas Jardine, the England captain, had come up with this tactic that was euphemistically known as fast leg theory, which is, of course, fast short-pitched bowling aimed at the batsman, which would force him to fend the ball away to that arc of close fielders all basically squatting, almost hands in his pockets. Or if they decided to take the bowler on with the hook, then they were chancing holding out to more fielders on deep on the boundary square, backward square. And of course, with the bowling all dug in at the batsman on the leg stump or slightly wide of it, he could pack the leg side field and not worry about scoring runs on the offside. It was decidedly unsporting at the very best, albeit it wasn't actually illegal at the time, but only because nobody'd been so single-minded as to try it before. And of course, therefore, nobody'd felt the need to actually legislate against it. Jardine, however, was a prickly character. He could be seen as superior and standoffish. And he was also a genuine jazz hat cricketer. He played for the Harlequins. He wore a Harlequin cap all the time. And of course, none of this went down particularly well in Australia. He was entirely aware of this. The love was mutual. So when it came to taking an Ashes squad down under, he seemed to think this was time to take the gloves off. And with several fast bowlers in the squad, he had plenty of resources to actually execute this tactic. Gubby Allen wasn't particularly keen, but Larwood, Vose and Bowes all stood up and were very, very happy to try and implement this. That long sea voyage gave them plenty of time to plan, to refine it, so that when they actually played the last tour match before the first test, they were absolutely ready and raring to go. Larwood and Vos in particular had quite a light workload up to this point, so they were really looking to slip the leash. Now, that first test, Australia were without Bradman, but that didn't actually mean they didn't have to try it out. They used it in shorter bursts rather than just as a constant barrage all the time, but it was undeniably effective. In Australia's first innings, McCabe made a fantastic, brilliant, very brave 187, but that was the only real highlight of the innings. England responded to Australia's 360 with 524, which is a superb score built around a marvellous 194 by Sutcliffe and a really classy century, a debut century by His Highness the Nawab of Pataudi. Now, Australia collapsed in their second innings, again a combination of that bodyline and sustained conventional fast bowling on a full length, which meant that England had a comfortable 10-wicket victory. Into the second test at Melbourne, now Bradman, having seen what happened in the first test, shaped up to play the expected bouncer and was bowled first ball by a full-length ball.
There is a way.
Even the greats are fallible. Australia only managed 228, but then Bill O'Reilly, bowling wrist spin at genuine medium pace, proved too much for the England batsman. He made that 228 actually look pretty respectable. Bradman made a century in the second innings to set the game up for O'Reilly to repeat the lesson when England batted again. So chasing 250, they were all out quite quickly, and so it was 1-1. And this was just setting the scene. So third test at Adelaide was when it really boiled over. England batted first, top order struggled, but then the middle order, Leyland, Wyatt and Painter, took them to 341. In reply, the Australians were absolutely hammered out, 222 all out. Woodfull, with the captain, was hit very hard on the chest. He was coughing and spitting blood. Oldfield retired hurt to hospital with a fractured skull, courtesy of a short ball by Larwood. The confrontation between the England management and Woodfull, and the management, they'd gone in to see Woodfull, to see how he was after he'd been hit on the chest. This was actually before Oldfield had been hit. They'd gone into the Australian dressing room, and Woodfull's response wasn't particularly polite. It was very restrained. It could have been a lot worse, but the conversation got actually leaked to the press, and that in its own right created a massive shockwave. And for one thing, what Woodfull said to Plum Warner, who is the England manager, was itself quite a strong message. And he said, "I don't want to see you, Mr. Warner. There are two teams out there. One is trying to play cricket and the other is not." You know, that on its own, that as a comment on what was happening was incredibly powerful. But then secondly, the fact that it was reported by the press really fanned the flames, because this was the first time that a story had actually come out of the dressing room. Before that, the doors had been closed, nothing ever leaked out. So there was something incredibly striking about quite simply the fact that story had broken. In past the rest day, England then had a good second innings performance, so they set Australia 532 to win. And despite really gritty innings by Woodfull, despite his injuries, and Bradman, they were all out to give England a really heavy victory, 338 runs. Now, ironically, of course, those two significant injuries, Woodfull's chest injury and the hit on the head for Oldfield, neither of those was actually caused by concentrated short pitch bowling. They were each isolated deliveries, but the constant use of that short pitched fast bowling aimed at the batsman, aimed at his body, with a concentrated leg side field around him, even continuing after they'd hit these two batsmen and had them walking away from the crease, obviously in significant pain, really fired the crowd up and really also had that growing, incredibly inflammatory impact on the press. There was an exchange of cables between the Australian Board of Control and the MCC. It finally cooled to the point where the ABC withdrew its very emotive accusation of unsportsmanlike conduct, which then meant that the tour could continue. At the same time, away from the actual playing of the cricket itself, it had the makings of a full-scale international incident, because the Australian government became involved. They were engaged in a lot of very serious and very painful discussions with the British Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, Secretary of State for Trade, and it was actually getting to the point where it could turn into a major breakdown in international relationship between England or Britain and Australia. It was only after the Australian Prime Minister got actually turned around to the government in Australia and said, pull back a little bit, that everything started to cool down, because they could see they were kind of standing on the edge of the abyss and looking in. So this meant that after that third test, there was a bit of a reset. And then it went on to the fourth test at Brisbane at the Gabba. This was an altogether calmer affair. And Ames and Painter actually saw them home, so a 6-wicket victory. So now 3-1 with the series won, but the fifth and final test then back at Sydney. Bill Vose back in the side, albeit not quite 100%. Gubby Allen not fully fit. The Australians made a very quick 435. O'Brien, McCabe, Darling and Oldfield, who's now recovering from his Adelaide injuries, all made 50s. But Larwood took 4 wickets and Verity took 3, the brilliant spinner. England again matched them, so we, all pretty much all square at the end of the 2 first innings. Wally Hammond then made a century, and Harold Larwood, batting as night watchman, made an absolutely famous 98. So Australia were only 19 behind at the start of the second innings, but then their second innings again failed to really make progress. Verity took 5 for 33, kept pegging them back, taking critical wickets at vital times, with lots of support from the faster bowlers. So rather than the actual battering ram of Bodyline, they were playing in a much more conventional way. England made the chase look reasonably comfortable. Wyatt and Hammond saw them home with an unbroken 125 partnership. So that won the series 3-1. Bradman had quite by his standards, a quiet series. So from that perspective, the Bodyline tactic has worked. It has done what it was intended to. Back in England, the bowlers continued to use the tactics, but then the touring West Indians in their first tour to England tried it out, Martindale and Constantine. But the match, the reporting, the widespread public response in the UK, both through and after the season, led to England quite deliberately stepping away from continuing the experiment with Bodyline. Even Wisden in the almanac for 1934 noted that most of those watching it for the first time must have come to the conclusion that while strictly within the law, it was not nice. The Australian tour to England in 1934 was quite a tense affair, because obviously all these very raw emotions still in place, and again the risk of diplomatic estrangement flared up with some alleged breaches of a gentleman's agreement at times not to repeat the tactics. But the following winter, 34-35, law changes brought in response to outlaw overly aggressive bowling essentially meant that Bodyline at that point was over. So what really was it? One test in Adelaide saw a concerted and sustained attack with umbrella fields surrounding the batsman. But the shorter bursts in previous later games, the injuries to Woodfull and Oldfield, and the frenetic atmosphere in the press, the general public, magnified that shock effect. It comprised a direct and deliberate attack on the batsman. It was attacks on his head and his upper body. As I said before, it wasn't actually illegal, but only because nobody had really considered that somebody would try it. it's often painted as Jardine against Australia, as if he was the arch nemesis of Australia, and that he was the architect of this. And while it's true that he was at the epicenter, the team backed him unequivocally. There were some very tense meetings post Adelaide, but the team all actually backed continuing with the use of Bodyline, albeit in a less concentrated form. The MCC had also backed their captain. I mean, in those discussions with the ABC, they were very firmly, although obviously they hadn't seen what was happening because they were back in London, but they were very firmly of the opinion that their confidence in the team and the captain would not be misplaced. And what of its legacy? Of course, it led to changes in the law, multiple changes. It created a cultural memory, a narrative of conduct that stepped outside the bounds of sportsmanship. It shook the relationship between England and Australia to its very roots, and its echoes can still be heard now. It established a precedent as well. Of course, the aggressive bowling of Lillian Thompson in 1974 and 75 against the West Indies and against England. The West Indies quicks of the late 70s and the early 80s were all echoes of Bodyline. It did truly change the shape and the feel of the game, and it all came back to that moment in time, that Adelaide Test. So each one of those, and of course I mentioned Lillian Thompson, I mentioned the West Indian quicks in the 70s and 80s, each one of them, whenever people look back at those series, when those bowlers have bowled quickly, aggressively, it automatically takes people's minds back to the Bodyline series. Probably the biggest thing to come out of it was that recognition that in sports there are certain codes of conduct to do with what is basically sportsmanlike Corinthian principles of behaviour. So you quite simply, you don't deliberately, maliciously, and aggressively target the batsman.
Yeah. No, Bodyline is just, well, it is a proper piece of cricket history, and like you said, it has affected all different walks of life. Ian, thank you so much. Look forward to next week.
Pleasure. Look forward to it. Take care.